This is TK Academy, which is Team Knowledge for Architects and Designers. This is one of our specialty courses, and our topic is the treatment of historic properties. Here are the learning objectives for this course. After completing this course, you will be able to identify the federal agency responsible for the development and maintenance of the standards for the treatment of historic properties. Identify the 4 approaches to the treatment of historic properties. Explain the role of the State Historical Preservation Office, also known as SHPO, in a project involving a historic property, and describe what a Section 106 review is. The standards for the treatment of historic properties came out of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. This piece of legislation had the purpose of expanding and maintaining a national register of historic places throughout our country. It called for the development and administration of a program for the preservation of properties that were to be included on the National Register of Historic Places, and it required the establishment of professional standards for the preservation of historic properties. When this law was passed, it was tasked to the U.S. Department of Interior, specifically the National Park Service, with the responsibility for development and maintenance of the standards. The standards are advisory. They are not regulatory, such as in laws or building codes. There are 4 approaches to the treatment of historic properties. These are preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, or reconstruction. The choice for the method of treatment is a decision that is based upon the property's historical significance, its current physical condition, and its proposed future use. Preservation is the method that is used on historically significant buildings or structures. This method is used when the focus is on maintaining the existing integrity and character of the historic resource. Preservation is defined as the act or process of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of a historic property. The work performed underneath this method is focused on the maintenance, repair, and stabilization of an existing historic property and how it has evolved over time. The preservation method excludes building additions, renovations, or remodels. The standard for preservation requires retention of the greatest amount of historic fabric along with the building's historic form. Rehabilitation maintains the existing integrity and character of a historic structure, but allows major additions or alterations to accommodate a compatible contemporary use. Rehabilitation is defined as the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions, while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. Rehabilitation is a method that is used when a building is or will be occupied by a user group. With rehabilitation, the historical character of a property is retained and preserved, and each property will be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding features or elements from another time period, will not be undertaken. New additions and alterations will not destroy the historic character of the property. New additions and alterations will be undertaken in such a manner that, if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment will not be impaired. The restoration method reestablishes the form, features, and character of a historic property at the specific past period. It is defined as the act or process of accurately depicting the form, features, and character of a property as it appeared at a particular period by means of removal of features from other periods of its history and reconstruction of missing features from the restoration period. The restoration standard allows for the depiction of a building at a particular time in its history by preserving materials, features, finishes, and spaces from its period of significance and removing those from other periods. The property will be used as it was historically, or be given a new use that interprets the property and its restoration period. Distinctive materials, features, finishes, and construction techniques, or examples of craftsmanship that characterize that period, will be preserved. Deteriorated features from that period will be repaired rather than replaced. When the severity of deterioration requires the replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature will match the old in design, color, texture, and where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features from the period will be substantiated by documentation. A false sense of history will not be created by adding features from other periods or properties, or by combining features that never existed together historically. The reconstruction method is used for recreating vanished or non-surviving portions of a property. It is defined as the act or process of depicting, by means of new construction, the form, features, and detailing of a non-surviving site, landscape, building, structure, or object for the purpose of replicating its appearance at a specific period and in its historic location. The reconstruction method is used when there is documentation and physical evidence to permit accurate reconstruction with minimal conjecture, and such reconstruction is essential to the public understanding of the historic property. Reconstruction is preceded by a thorough archaeological investigation to identify and evaluate those features and artifacts which are essential to an accurate reconstruction. The reconstruction effort will take every means possible to preserve any remaining historic materials, features, and spatial relationships. A reconstruction will be clearly identified as a contemporary recreation. It will never falsely mislead as being original. There are times when a historic property requires expansion through a new addition or adjacent new construction. Rehabilitation is the only method that allows expanding a historic property by enlarging it with an addition. However, the rehabilitation guidelines emphasize that new additions should be considered only after it is determined that meeting specific new needs cannot be achieved by altering interior spaces. If the use cannot be accommodated in this way, then an attached exterior addition may be considered. New additions should be subordinate to the historic property. They should be designed and constructed so that the character-defining features of the historic building, the site, and setting are not negatively impacted. New additions and adjacent construction must preserve the building's historic character, significant materials, and features. New additions and adjacent construction must be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and design of the historic building while differentiating from the original structure. New additions should be designed and constructed to retain the integrity of the historic property so that it would remain even if the addition or adjacent property were to be removed in the future. Regardless of the historic treatment method being used, regulatory requirements must be addressed. Building codes and life safety requirements must still be met and typically take precedence over historic context. All public buildings are required to provide accessibility for the disabled. When working with a historic property, the goal should be to provide the highest level of accessibility with the least impact on the historic context. Accessible features that are implemented should result in minimum or no loss of historic character defining space, features, or finishes. The life safety features are critical on every building and structure. Older buildings commonly use materials which we now know include hazardous or dangerous components. Hazardous materials such as asbestos and lead-based paint are required to be abated or encapsulated. Other life safety features such as building egress and fire protection are required to be incorporated into any historic property that is going to be occupied and used. It is important to coordinate with code officials early in the project planning to design to integrate life safety features without negatively impacting the historic character of the property. When Congress passed the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, it also created a new state government function. The Act delegated to each state the responsibility of surveying, evaluating, and nominating significant historic properties to the National Register of Historic Places. The State Historic Preservation Office, often referred to as SHPO, administers the National Historic Preservation Program at the state level by reviewing nominations for inclusion to the National Register of Historic Places, maintaining data on historic properties, and consulting with federal agencies during a Section 106 review. State historical preservation offices are designated by the governor of the respected state or territory. There are currently state historical preservation offices located in all 50 states and territories. When a federal agency funds, licenses, or permits an activity that may affect cultural or historic resources, that federal agency must consult with the State Historic Preservation Office of that respected state or territory. This process is known as a Section 106 review or consultation. The Section 106 review is a consideration process involving a series of steps. These steps include the following: identifying and evaluating the eligibility of the cultural or historic resource for inclusion onto the National Register of Historic Properties, determining effects of the proposed intervention on the property's eligibility for inclusion onto the register, and seeking alternatives to avoid, minimize, or mitigate negative effects to such properties. With the passing of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, it was the National Park Service who was delegated the responsibility for developing and maintaining the standards for the treatment of historic properties. Within the National Park Service, there is the Technical Preservation Services Office, which provides technical assistance and guidance on the preservation of historic properties. Not only is this department responsible for maintaining the standards and the Register of Historic Places, but they are a wealth of knowledge and information on technical guidance for the preservation of historic buildings and landscapes. The Technical Preservation Services has developed publications which have become the industry standard and the basis for responsible care of historic buildings. There are two categories to these publications: the Preservation Briefs and the Preservation Tech Notes. These are widely used resources by historic preservational professionals, federal, state, and local government officials, and historic property owners. Preservation briefs provide in-depth information on preserving, rehabilitating, and restoring historic buildings. These publications are intended to help recognize and resolve common problems prior to beginning work. Some provide guidance on the appropriate treatment of traditional building materials such as slate roofing, plaster, and masonry, while others address architectural features including storefronts and porches, or focus on the reuse of specific building types such as historic gas stations or barns. The Technical Preservation Services currently has 50 different preservation brief publications that are available and can be purchased through the U.S. government bookstore. Preservation Tech Notes are case studies in historic preservation that provide practical information on traditional practices and innovative techniques for successfully maintaining and preserving cultural and historic resources. Preservation Tech Notes address common building components such as doors and windows, exterior woodwork, finishes, glass, masonry, metals, and the site. There are currently more than 50 publications that are available, and these are free to download from the Technical Preservation Services website. So far in the presentation, we have achieved our learning objectives. We have identified the National Park Service as a federal agency that is responsible for developing and maintaining the standards of the treatment of historic properties. We have identified the four approaches of preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction within the treatment of historic properties. We've explained the role of the State Historic Preservation Office and their part in the process of reviewing nominations of historic properties to be added to the National Register of Historic Places and reviewing the impacts on historic properties. And we have described that when federal funds are used, a Section 106 review and consultation must be done to mitigate the negative effects on such historic properties. For the remainder of this presentation, we are going to change directions and review a brief history of architectural styles in America. With the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the following Revolutionary War, the 13 colonies became a new country. However, there was still a colonial mindset as expressed within their architecture. This colonial period lasted from approximately 1780 to 1820. The United States was still a very new country, and there were very few large-scale civic projects being done. Most of the buildings during this period were small-scale and residential in nature. One of the architectural styles during this time was known as federalism. Federalism almost always applied to houses. These buildings were 2 stories and symmetrical, with the main entrance placed along the center of the front. There was typically a long porch along the front that was supported by columns. The roof line was broken up with window dormers, and there commonly were 2 chimneys placed on both ends of the building. The federalism style is very similar to the Georgian style, and both were used predominantly in the South on southern plantation mansions. In the North, it was the New England salt box, which had some similar themes but had a different roof line and did not include window dormers. Another architectural style in early America was developed by one of our founding fathers and 3rd President, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the only U.S. president who was also an architect. The architectural style that he developed became known as Jeffersonian Classicism. In this style, you would see the classic elements such as domes, porticos, and columns. This style also made use of semicircular fanlight windows. However, Jeffersonian Classicism is most recognizable by its distinguishing characteristic traits of red brick masonry and white trim. This architectural style was obviously very popular within Jefferson's home state of Virginia. Jefferson's own house in Monticello, Charlottesville, Virginia, is a prime example of this style. Jeffersonian Classicism was also used in the establishment and construction of the University of Virginia. As America began its westward expansion and growth, so did its need for public buildings to house its new government. Architects looked back toward Europe to find an architectural style that would represent these new ideals of America. But Europe was full of monarchies and empires, and none of the current architectural styles seemed to be appropriate for the United States. America was going to be different. It was going to be a republic. Architects would have to search back in time to find a civilization whose government more aligned with that of America, and they found one with the Roman Republic. Therefore, many early American architectural works mimicked the style of Rome, and this became known as the Roman Revival. The Romans were known for their ingenuity in architecture and engineering, and their structures lasted for centuries. This seemed to be a strong idea for the founding of a new nation. Roman Revival architecture made use of those building components that are specifically Roman: the Roman order columns, centralized dome, and the curved arch. A prime example of Roman Revival architectural style being used in the United States is the U.S. National Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Although Rome was a republic, democracy was not its own invention. The earliest democracies were first found in Greek civilization. Greek was not one nation, but rather a series of independent city-states that were connected by a single unified culture. Many believe that this more represented the federalized system of the United States of America. Therefore, many early American buildings started to mimic Greek architecture, and this became known as the Greek Revival style. The Greek Revival architecture is known for its bilateral symmetry and its portico and cornice on the ends, but also makes it expressively Greek is its use of Greek order columns. An expression of the Greek Revival architecture can be seen in the U.S. Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. This period of borrowing from the past in both Roman and Greek revivals is known as the Neoclassical period, and this lasted from 1820 to 1860. The United States may not have won its war for independence had it not been for the support of its longest and oldest ally in France. The French culture would also have an influence on American architecture. Coupled with this was the fact that there were very few American architects for one to apprentice under, and was no formalized system of training and education in the United States for one to become an architect. Therefore, most American architects ventured to Europe to study in one of their elite schools. One of the most common and well-attended schools was known as the École des Beaux-Arts, which was in Paris. American architects would spend years studying here, exposed to French architecture and culture. They would bring back many of these ideas into the United States and incorporate them into American architecture. This period was known as the High Victorian period that ran from 1860 to 1890. One of these styles was known as Chateauesque. Its characteristics include an asymmetrical design and high, steep, sloping roofs that were broken up with multiple window dormers. This style was primarily implemented on residential work, and you can see the influence from the European castles and cathedrals. A fine example of this style was the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, which was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, who studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Also popular during the High Victorian period was the Second Empire style, which is sometimes referred to as Napoleon III. This style was primarily featured in small residential work and is characteristically defined by its high mansard roof, which is broken up by window dormers. The facade was very ornate and often used superimposed columns onto the relief of the exterior wall surface. Both styles of High Victorian were known to use tower-like elements that were set off from the design, usually on the corner or to the side of the building. Toward the end of the 19th and earliest 20th centuries, American architects continued this trend of looking back towards Europe and mimicking the styles of the past. This led to a series of architectural revivals that were usually subject to the type and function of the building and where it was located. The colonial revival was used heavily within the Midwest and looked as far back only to its earlier predecessor in the 13 colonies. Colonial revival is characteristic of a colonnized portico along the front, and directly above that was a centralized cupola. It was symmetrical in its layout, and its facade with the entry portico and cupola forming the center line of symmetry. Colonial revival made extensive use of brick, which was one of the dominant building materials of the Midwest. Gothic revival was used mostly with churches and religious institutions, and heavily mimicked the earlier Gothic styles of Europe. Probably the most defining characteristic of Gothic and Gothic revival is its use of the pointed arch and steeply pitched roofs. There is a heavy emphasis on vertical lines and spaces, as if the church were ascending heavenly toward God. To add to that theme, Gothic revival typically had a tower, which was offset from the line of symmetry and was the highest feature within the building. The Renaissance revival mimicked the themes and design elements of the Renaissance, which itself was a revival. This style emphasized the use of rounded arches, which was originally a Roman invention. The lower ground level was always emphasized with heavy rustication and texture. The Renaissance revival used low or flat-pitched roofs. This style was used heavily in civic and commercial buildings across the country. The Beaux-Arts style was very grandiose and formal. It had grand size and scale. The first level was always elevated and had a formal grand staircase leading up to its entry, and the ground level was usually distinguished by heavy rustication. The Beaux-Arts style was symmetrical and would have a strong sense of rhythm across the facade. It also had a very ornate wall surface and included many relief sculptures from historic elements of the past. The Beaux-Arts style was used primarily for civic and public buildings, and it represented a sophisticated understanding of historic themes of the past. The United States had Latin America as its neighbor to the south, and many of the United States territories of the Southwest were once Spanish colonies. Therefore, Spanish colonial would also have its influence on American architecture. The Spanish colonial style is characterized by its reddish-orange, undulating Spanish tiles on the roof, and its smooth stucco wall surfaces. As with other architectural styles with European influence, there is an emphasis on the curved arch. The Spanish colonial style is typically asymmetrical and usually includes some type of elevated high tower. This style was used in areas of the United States that were once underneath Spanish control, such as Florida and the Southwest. The Pueblo Revival is the only revival that has its origins within America. This style lends itself to the workings of the early Native Americans in the Southwest who built their homes, or pueblos, out of mud and clay. Due to the nature of the exterior wall materials, the Pueblo Revival style usually has very thick and massive walls, which are emphasized by the punched window openings within its facade. Also, due to the material, the corners are typically more rounded and softer than rigid and angular. The Pueblo Revival was used predominantly in the Southwest in the areas of New Mexico and Arizona. Up to the end of the 19th century, American architects simply mimicked the styles of Europe in the past. But this began to change as American architects began to develop their own styles. There were three American architects who were often referred to collectively as the Trinity of American architects, who deviated from the European past and began to carve a path forward for American architecture. These three American architects were Henry Richardson, Louis Sullivan, and Frank Lloyd Wright. Henry Richardson was the first of these three. He received his formal training as an architect from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. His practice, however, pulled from elements of the past, but began to develop a new style for the future of America. The style that he developed, Richardsonian Romanesque, was named after him. This style was Romanesque in that Richardson still made use of the arch, especially a prominent oversized arch at the entry of the building. How it deviated from other styles was the use of heavy rustication and rough-cut stone throughout the building. Richardsonian Romanesque style typically included a tower with a four-sided pyramid roof. Richardson's buildings often looked very massive and heavy, but his use of natural cut stone made it look like it was an extension out of the ground. Thus began the trend in American architecture of connecting the building to the site. Louis Sullivan was an American architect who practiced in Chicago after the Great Chicago Fire destroyed most of the city. This was also during the industrial period, and there were significant changes in the use of steel and how buildings were erected and constructed. The rebuilding of the city of Chicago, combined with the new developments of construction techniques and materials, led to a construction boom. The use of steel framing for buildings allowed buildings to rise to greater heights than ever before. Sullivan was one of the American architects who led the way for the development of the American high-rise. Known for his expression, "form follows function," Sullivan led the way for the aesthetics that would accompany this new technique in tall buildings. His style is known as Sullivanesque and included tall vertical bands of windows to emphasize the height of new buildings. The Sullivanesque style also included a flat roof with large overhanging projecting eaves. Like the Richardsonian Romanesque, Sullivanesque also used large rounded archways at the entry of the building. Probably the most characteristic trait of Sullivanesque buildings is the sculptural ornamentation that adorned the facades and the tops of the buildings, typically inspired by nature and included natural-looking elements. This again reinforced what was started with Richardson and strengthened this connection between architecture and nature as an American theme. The most well-known of all American architects is Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright began his career as an apprentice and student working out of the offices of Sullivan in Chicago. However, Wright began to take on clients as his own as a side business in a practice that has been referred to as moonlighting. When Sullivan discovered this, Wright was quickly fired and was left to begin his own practice. Wright was heavily inspired by nature, and the architectural approach that he developed he referred to as organic architecture. Wright's belief was that a building should grow naturally out of its site. He also believed that spaces should flow naturally into each other and not be confined to the restrictions of a box. Wright exploded this box, and his buildings extended naturally out into the site. This led to the term open plan, which is still predominantly used today in residential buildings. Wright's buildings would have an emphasis on horizontal lines. His buildings used low-pitched roofs that would further emphasize the horizontal nature of the building. Wright's buildings would make use of large overhanging features, and his use of cantilevers would make things appear that they were floating without any support. Also in Wright's buildings was the use of natural colors and materials inspired by the nearby site. Wright began his practice in Spring Green, Wisconsin, in his home and studio that he named Taliesin. Later in his career, he developed a second home and studio in Scottsdale, Arizona, which he named Taliesin West. The word Taliesin came from a Welsh word meaning brow. Wright chose this word to support his belief that a building should not be at the bottom nor at the top of a hill, but rather right where the hill started to crest, or the brow of the hill. Wright believed that this was the most natural place for a building to exist and where it was most integrated into a site. Wright's approach to organic architecture is probably best demonstrated in his most famous piece of work, the Kaufman House, often referred to as falling water. Not only does the building nestle naturally into its site, but Wright's use of long overhanging cantilevers seem to mimic the cascade of the falls itself. Falling water is often referred to as America's favorite house. While the Americans were developing their own unique architectural style, Europe was bogged down in two world wars. At the end of World War II, widespread destruction across Europe laid in its wake. There was a need to mass-produce buildings to replace those destroyed in World War II. This led to the European architects of that era founding and developing a new approach to building referred to as the International Style. The three primary architects to lead this effort were Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and Le Corbusier. These three architects, along with a school in Germany referred to as the Bauhaus, really explored the idea of the machine art. This school of thought looked beyond just buildings and explored all items that could be mass-produced by the machine. In stark contrast to those that were being produced by the craftsman style, the international style, or machine art, looked at how things could be built by machine rather than by human hands. Thus, the international style became the first architectural style of the modern period. This architectural style built on previous development of steel as forming the structure of the building, but rather than hiding or enclosing the steel, allowing it to be part of the expression itself. It also made heavy use out of the cantilever. By pulling the columns inward and cantilevering the floor and the roof, there were no longer need for exterior walls to form any of the load-bearing or structural function of the building. This allowed the exterior walls to be built out of other materials that do not have to bear any load, such as glass. Hence the development and the introduction of the glass curtain wall in architecture. By using lightweight materials such as glass as the building enclosure and using strong steel as the framing system, buildings were allowed to go to much greater heights than ever previously conceived. A modern-day skyscraper is the development of this period. The use of glass on the exterior enclosing system also allowed the introduction of panoramic views and large amounts of daylight into the building. In keeping with the concept of machine art, buildings were void of any ornamentation and typically had very smooth surfaces and rigid angles. In stark contrast to what the Americans were doing, connecting nature and architecture, the international style did the exact opposite, separating the building from a site. Without any relationship to context, the building could be placed anywhere in the world, hence the name for the international style. This architectural style and way of building quickly populated throughout the entire world. A great example of the international style is the U.S. Air Force Academy located in Colorado. Ending with the modern period and international style brings us into the period of contemporary architecture and the end of this presentation on the treatment of historic properties. If you enjoyed this course, please like and leave us a comment. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more courses like this and other content from TK Architecture.